In the 10th century, on the southern shores of the Sea of Galilee, a man named Aaron ben Asher dipped a reed pen into black soot-based ink and touched the surface of a parchment page. This was the city of Tiberias, a place of heat, basalt stone, and ancient scholarship. Ben Asher was not writing new words. He was not even writing new letters. Instead, he was adding a series of tiny, precise pinpricks, dashes, and dots around the heavy, square characters of the Hebrew text. These marks, known as nikud, are so small they can be mistaken for dust or the incidental splatters of a weary scribe. Yet, these dots represent one of the most significant architectural shifts in the history of the written word. They are the vowels. Before this moment, for over 1,000 years, the Hebrew Bible was a skeleton of consonants. It was a language of stone, solid and silent, waiting for the human breath to bring it to life. By adding these marks, the Masoretes, the family of scribes to which Ben Asher belonged, did something far more profound than clarifying pronunciation. They effectively chose one meaning out of many, pinning down the fluttering wings of a living, ambiguous language and fixing it to the page forever. The gap between the written letter and the spoken word is where the Masoretes lived. In ancient Hebrew, as in many Semitic languages, vowels were not typically written. The reader encountered a string of consonants and, drawing upon a deep well of oral tradition, supplied the vowels from memory. If you saw the letters HLB, you knew from the context whether to read halav, meaning milk, or helav, meaning fat. This system worked as long as the community remained intact, as long as the chain of teacher to student remained unbroken. But the Masoretes lived in a time of deep anxiety. The Jewish people were scattered across the edges of the known world, from the mountainous regions of Persia to the vibrant cities of Islamic Spain. In his introduction to the Tiberian Masorah, scholar Israel Yeivin describes the Masoretic project as an act of desperate preservation. They looked at the sacred scrolls and saw a silence that was becoming dangerous. They feared that as the language of the diaspora shifted, the true breath of the scriptures would be lost, and with it, the correct way to perform the commandments of God. They set out to create a system that would make the oral tradition visible, turning the ear's memory into the eye's certainty. The labor was immense. The Masoretes did not merely add vowels, they created a secondary layer of information that surrounds the text like a protective hedge. This is the Masorah. In the margins of the great codices, like the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex, they wrote thousands of tiny notes in Aramaic. They counted every letter of every book. They noted that the letter Vav in the word Geshon in the book of Leviticus was the exact middle letter of the entire Torah. They tracked how many times a word appeared with a specific spelling, or how many times a particular phrase appeared only at the beginning of a verse. This was not mere trivia. It was a forensic accounting of the divine word. As Israel Yeivin points out, the Masoretes were obsessed with correctness. If an ancient scroll had a letter that was written slightly larger than the others, or a letter that was oddly suspended above the line, the Masoretes did not fix it. They preserved the anomaly and wrote a note in the margin to ensure no future scribe would think it was a mistake. They were building a cage of data around the text, ensuring that not a single jot or tittle could be altered by the passage of time or the frailty of human memory. But as we descend further into their work, we begin to see the tension that this precision created. When you provide a vowel for a word that was previously just a skeleton of consonants, you are performing an act of interpretation. You are closing a door. Consider the work of James Barr in the Typography of the Vulgate Bible. Barr explores how the ancient translations, like the Greek Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate, often reflect a Hebrew text that sounds different from the one the Masoretes eventually codified. Because those early translators were working with a purely consonantal text, they sometimes voweled the words differently in their minds. A famous example occurs in the Psalms. The consonants kry can be read as kari, meaning like a lion, or, with a slight shift in the vowel tradition, it can be read as a verb meaning they pierced. The Masoretic text gives us like a lion, while the earlier Greek tradition, which would later influence the Christian world, read they pierced. The consonants remained the same, but the vowels created two entirely different theological worlds. The Masoretes were not just scribes, they were the final arbiters of meaning. They chose which path the reader would take. This process of fixing the text is what scholars call vocalization, but it might be more accurately described as a domestication of the divine. Before the dots and dashes of Tiberias, the Hebrew Bible was a landscape of potential. It was a fluid, almost musical experience where the reader was an active participant in creating the meaning of the verse. By providing the nikud, the Masoretes provided the correct way to breathe. They even added t'amim, or cantillation marks, which tell the reader exactly which syllable to stress and which musical motif to use when chanting. They were recording a performance. But a recording is not the same as a live voice. When you look at the page of a Masoretic Bible, you are seeing a snapshot of how one specific family in 10th century Galilee believed the Bible should sound. Their tradition, the Ben Asher tradition, eventually won out over rival systems such as the Ben Naphtali tradition or the older Babylonian systems of vocalization. We read the Bible today through the specific linguistic lens of the Ben Asher family. Their interpretation has become our reality. The turn in this story is the realization that the purity of the text we possess is a manufactured purity. We often speak of the Masoretic Text as the original Hebrew, but it is actually a highly refined, edited, and polished version of much older, more chaotic manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, revealed a world where different versions of the biblical books existed side by side, some with different spellings, some with extra words, some with different arrangements of verses. The Masoretes took that raw, ancient material and ironed it out. They were like gardeners who took a wild, overgrown forest and turned it into a formal, structured park. The park is beautiful, and it is easy to navigate, but we must remember that it was once a forest. James Barr's research highlights that while the Masoretes were incredibly faithful to the tradition they received, they were still human beings making choices. Every dot they placed was a decision to exclude an alternative. Every accent mark they drew was a decree on how the word must be felt. There is a certain reverence in their labor that is undeniable. To spend a lifetime counting letters and marking the frequency of the word and is a form of prayer. Yet, we are left with a fundamental question about the nature of sacred text. Is the true Bible the one that is clear, voweled, and easy to follow, or is it the one that lies beneath the ink, the silent, difficult, and ambiguous skeleton that requires the reader to bring their own breath, their own struggle, and their own memory to the page? The Masoretes gave us a gift of clarity, but they also took away the necessity of the search. They silenced the many voices that once echoed in the gaps between the consonants, replacing them with a single, authoritative chant that has lasted for a millennium. We can now read the text with a certainty that the ancients never had, but that certainty comes at a cost. We are no longer required to wonder what the letters might be saying to us in the silence. When we open a modern Hebrew Bible, we are seeing the triumph of the Ben Asher family. We see the black dots, the sharp dashes, and the elegant curves of the cantillation marks. We hear the melody they intended for us to hear. But if we were to scrape away the 10th century ink, if we were to look only at the stark, naked consonants of the ancient scrolls, would we still recognize the voice of the divine, or have we become so dependent on the vowels of the Masoretes that we have lost the ability to hear the God who speaks in the spaces between the letters?